Ethan Walker had been working as a forest ranger for many years. He knew the woods better than most people in town. Every morning he packed his bag, checked his boots, and set off to walk the forest trails. His job was to keep an eye on the wildlife, make sure campers followed the rules, and look for anything unusual. Usually his patrols were calm and uneventful. Sometimes he saw deer grazing in the clearings, sometimes an owl sitting on a branch, and sometimes just the peaceful stillness of trees all around him. But on this particular day, something felt different from the moment he stepped into the forest. The air seemed heavier, and the silence was unusual. Normally, Ethan would hear birds chirping or squirrels rustling through the leaves, but that morning, the woods seemed too quiet. He tightened the strap of his backpack and kept walking, his eyes carefully scanning the trail. He noticed broken branches lying across the ground. At first, he thought it might have been a storm the night before, but the sky had been clear and calm. The breaks in the branches looked fresh, almost as if something heavy had moved through the area. Ethan knelt down to take a closer look at the forest floor. The soil was disturbed, and there were odd markings in the dirt. They didn't look like deer tracks, nor did they resemble the footprints of hikers. The marks were larger, uneven, and scattered as if someone or something had dragged objects through the woods. He touched the dirt with his fingertips, still cool and moist, which told him the tracks weren't old. Whatever had passed through had been there not long before him. Curiosity rising inside him, Ethan followed the trail. He moved slowly and carefully, the way he always did when observing wildlife. He didn't want to disturb anything, but something inside told him this was worth checking out. The trail twisted deeper into a part of the forest rarely visited by campers or hikers. Tall trees rose high above, their branches forming a canopy that blocked much of the sunlight. The deeper he went, the more unsettled he began to feel. Then he saw it. At first he thought it was just a pile of fallen branches, maybe from a tree that had collapsed. But as he got closer, he realized it was carefully arranged. His eyes widened. It wasn't a random pile at all, it was a nest. The structure was massive. Sticks, logs, dried leaves, and even patches of moss were woven together in a strange, deliberate way. It was shaped like a bowl with an opening at the top. Ethan's heart pounded as he circled around it, studying every detail. He had seen large bird nests before, but never one this size. It was easily 6 or 7 feet across, far too big for any ordinary bird. He crouched down and studied the edges. That was when he noticed something even stranger. Mixed in with the natural materials were things that didn't belong there. Pieces of fabric, thin strands of rope, and what looked like a strip from a torn backpack. Ethan froze. Nests were supposed to be made from sticks, leaves, and grass, not human-made objects. His mind started racing. Could it belong to a very large animal? But no animal he knew of in this region built something like this. Bears dug dens. Coyotes found caves. Birds built nests, yes, but not this big, and certainly not using clothing or rope. Something about it didn't feel right. He stepped back and pulled out his small notebook. As a ranger, he was trained to document unusual findings. He quickly sketched the shape of the nest and wrote down a few notes. Then he took out his phone and snapped a couple of photos, thinking he would later show them to his supervisor. Just as he was about to take another step closer, a sound broke the silence. It was faint, almost like a soft rustling. Ethan turned sharply, his eyes darting toward the trees surrounding him. The sound didn't come from the wind. It was too steady, too deliberate. His pulse quickened. For a moment he thought it might be an animal moving in the underbrush, but then it stopped, leaving only the heavy silence of the woods. He held his breath and listened. Nothing. Ethan looked back at the nest. The longer he stared, the more uneasy he became. He noticed something else this time. On the outer edge of the nest, half buried under leaves, was a shoe. It was old, muddy, and torn, but it was unmistakably a human shoe. A chill ran down his spine. He bent to take a closer look, and his suspicions grew. This wasn't just an animal's nest. Someone had built this. But who would build such a thing in the middle of the forest? And for what reason? The questions circled in his mind as he stood there, staring at the strange structure. His instincts, sharpened over years of working in the woods, told him he needed to be careful. Something wasn't right. He took a slow step backward, his eyes still fixed on the nest, and then another step, trying not to make noise. Ethan thought about the reports he had heard in recent months. People in town had whispered about strange things in the forest. Odd noises at night, missing hikers, Even a child who had wandered away from a picnic and was found hours later shaken and crying, unable to explain what she had seen. At the time, Ethan dismissed most of it as exaggeration. People often let their imaginations run wild when it came to the woods. But standing there, looking at the enormous nest and the shoe by its edge, he began to wonder if the stories had some truth. He wanted to leave right away and call for backup, but something pulled him to stay a little longer. He needed to be certain. He crouched again, staring into the nest's opening, hoping to catch sight of what or who might be inside. But it was dark, the sticks and leaves layered too thickly to see clearly. He raised his phone to snap another photo, leaning slightly forward, when he heard it again. That faint rustle. This time it was clearer. It came from inside the nest. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He felt the hair on the back of his neck rise as he realized he was not alone. For a long moment he stood frozen, caught between fear and duty. His training told him to remain calm, but his instincts screamed at him to run. Yet he didn't move. He knew he had discovered something important, something that might explain the strange reports from town. He also knew that whatever he had found was no ordinary part of nature. With his heart thumping in his chest, Ethan slowly lowered his phone and stepped back. He didn't yet know what secrets the nest was hiding, but he was certain of one thing. It was no accident he had found it. This discovery would change everything. Ethan hardly slept that night after returning from his patrol. The image of the giant nest kept playing in his mind again and again. He tried to convince himself that it might just be a strange animal shelter, something rare but natural. But every time he remembered the torn shoe and the bits of rope stuck into the nest, his doubts grew heavier. He had worked in forests long enough to know that animals did not collect human belongings and build something that looked like a shelter. The next morning, Ethan packed his gear early. He told himself he would go back to the site to take a closer look. He needed answers. He made sure to carry his flashlight, notebook, water bottle, and an extra pair of gloves. He also carried his radio this time in case he needed to contact other rangers. His heart was restless, but his mind was clear. He had to find out what was hidden in that nest. The forest was quiet again when he entered. The same uneasy silence hung in the air, as if even the birds didn't want to sing. He followed the trail he had taken the day before, noticing again the broken branches and disturbed soil. This time he walked slower, his ears alert for every sound. The tall trees around him seemed to lean closer, making the path darker. When he reached the spot, the nest looked even more unsettling in the daylight. Sunlight streamed through the trees and revealed more details. The sticks and branches weren't just thrown together. They were woven tightly, like someone had put real effort into constructing it. Moss and dried grass were carefully placed, making it look almost like a bed. Ethan crouched near the edge and studied it again. The shoe was still there, half buried in leaves, and now he noticed more scraps of fabric hidden under the branches. He reached out with his gloved hand and carefully lifted one small piece. It was a strip of cloth, faded and dirty, but it looked like part of a child's shirt. Ethan's stomach tightened. This was no place for a child's clothing to be. He quickly put it into a plastic bag from his pack, planning to hand it over to authorities later. He stood up and listened. The forest gave no answer, only the faint sound of wind through the trees. Then out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something strange on the ground near the nest. He walked closer and found small footprints in the soil. They weren't animal prints. They were too narrow, too short. They looked like the prints of a human child. Ethan bent down to examine them. The prints were fresh, pressed deep into the dirt as if made only a day or two ago. A shiver ran down his spine. He straightened up quickly and scanned the trees. Was someone still here? Had the builder of this nest been nearby all along? He reached for his radio but stopped himself. If he called for help now, the noise might scare away whoever was here. He decided to stay quiet and watch. For almost half an hour, Ethan circled slowly around the nest, taking notes and photographs. He didn't go too close, worried about disturbing something he didn't fully understand. The deeper he looked, the more questions filled his mind. Why would someone build this in the middle of the forest? Why use clothing and rope? And who left the footprints? As he moved around the far side of the nest, his boot touched something soft under the leaves. He bent down and pulled at it gently. It was an old toy, dirty and weathered but still recognizable as a stuffed bear. Ethan froze. His hands trembled as he held it. A child's toy lying next to a giant nest was a sight that made his heart ache. He remembered a news report from weeks earlier, a missing girl from a nearby town. She had been about 10 years old. Police had searched but never found her. Could this be connected? Ethan's chest tightened as he put the toy into another bag. He knew now that he couldn't treat this as just an unusual find. Something serious was happening here. He decided not to touch anything else until the police could investigate. Still, part of him wanted to peek inside the nest again. He carefully leaned forward, shining his flashlight through the gaps in the branches. The beam cut through the darkness inside. At first, he saw only sticks and dried grass. Then, for just a second, he thought he saw movement. His breath caught. He leaned closer, the light trembling slightly in his hand. Two small, frightened eyes flashed back at him before quickly disappearing into the shadows. Ethan stumbled backward, nearly dropping his flashlight. He stood frozen, his mind racing. There was someone inside. Not an animal, not a shadow, but a human. He was certain of it. The eyes were too clear, too full of fear. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears. He wanted to call out, but his instincts told him to stay calm. Whoever was hiding in there might be too scared to respond, or worse, might be in danger from someone else. Ethan stepped back slowly, putting a safe distance between himself and the nest. He couldn't risk making the wrong move. He remembered his training. When faced with a suspicious or dangerous situation, secure the area and call for professional help. That was exactly what he needed to do. Still, as he stood there, he couldn't shake the thought of those eyes. They belonged to someone helpless, someone who needed rescue. His heart ached to act immediately, but he forced himself to think clearly. Rushing in could cause more harm than good. He backed away until the nest was half hidden by the trees again. He took out his phone, staring at it for a long moment. His thumb hovered over the emergency number. He wasn't the kind of man to panic, but this time he felt the weight of every decision. If he called now, the police might take time to arrive. Whoever was inside could run or hide deeper into the woods. But if he waited, something worse could happen. He took a deep breath and decided to trust his instincts. His instincts had kept him safe in storms, guided him when rescuing lost hikers, and warned him of danger. Right now, they told him he had discovered something more than a ranger's mystery. He had uncovered a hidden secret that could involve missing people. As he stood under the tall trees, gripping his phone tightly, Ethan realized his next steps would change everything. The giant nest was not just an odd structure in the forest anymore. It was the beginning of a truth that had to be uncovered. Ethan stood in the woods with his phone in his hand, his mind racing with what he had just seen. Those eyes, they were not the eyes of an animal. They were human. He was sure of it. And the fear in them was so clear, so real that it shook him deeply. He had worked for years as a ranger, but never had he stumbled upon something so strange, so unsettling. He lowered his phone for a moment, still torn about what to do next. The forest around him was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. He took a few slow steps backward, giving more distance between himself and the nest. His instincts told him to keep calm, to avoid startling whoever was inside. Ethan leaned against a tree, listening carefully. At first there was only silence. Then faintly he thought he heard a small sound, like a whimper, soft and frightened. It lasted only a second, but it was enough to convince him that a person, maybe even a child, was inside that strange nest. His chest tightened at the thought. He remembered the stuffed toy he had found earlier, the small footprints in the soil. Everything was starting to come together in a way that made his skin crawl. But what was going on here? Who built this strange nest? And why would a child be inside it? The questions tumbled in his head, but he knew he couldn't waste time just wondering. He needed to act. Ethan pulled out his notebook and quickly scribbled down his observations. The nest's size, the scraps of clothing, the shoe, the toy, and now the human eyes he had seen inside. He took a few more photos from a distance. His plan was clear. He would call the police. But before doing that, he wanted to make sure he could describe everything as clearly as possible. As he was writing, another sound made him freeze. It was a snap, like a stick breaking underfoot. His head shot up. Someone or something was nearby. He slowly turned, scanning the dense trees, his heart thumping in his chest. The sound hadn't come from the nest. It came from the woods beyond. Ethan crouched low, blending into the brush. He had learned to move quietly in the forest, and now that training came naturally. He watched carefully, his breath steady but shallow. For several tense seconds, nothing moved. Then, from between the trees, he caught a glimpse of something dark. Someone walking quickly, their figure partly hidden by the branches. It wasn't a child. The figure was taller, an adult. The person seemed to be carrying something, though Ethan couldn't see what it was. They moved with purpose, heading toward the nest. Ethan's body tensed. Could this be the one who built the nest? His instincts screamed at him not to reveal himself. He stayed perfectly still as the figure drew closer. When the person stepped into a patch of sunlight, Ethan saw more clearly. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothing, his hair messy, his face partly hidden by a beard. He looked rough, like someone who had been living outdoors for a long time. The man crouched near the nest, adjusting some of the branches. He moved them carefully, almost protectively, as if guarding whatever was inside. Ethan's stomach turned. This was no random structure, it was a shelter, and this man had built it. But why? And why was there a frightened child inside? Ethan knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. He had to act soon. He carefully slipped his phone back into his pocket and inched away, keeping the trees between himself and the man. His plan now was clear. He would not approach alone. This was far too dangerous. He needed backup. As he crept away, he heard a soft voice from the nest. It was faint, but Ethan was sure it was a child's voice. The man hushed the voice quickly, whispering something Ethan couldn't hear. That moment made Ethan's decision final. He had to call the police immediately. Once he was far enough from the nest to feel safe, Ethan pulled out his phone again. He stepped behind a thick oak tree, keeping his voice low as he dialed. When the dispatcher answered, Ethan explained everything in as much detail as he could. The giant nest, the clothing, the footprints, the toy, the eyes inside, and now the strange man who appeared to be guarding it. The dispatcher's tone grew serious. She told Ethan to stay where he was, keep eyes on the area if possible, but not to approach. A team would be sent right away. Ethan agreed, though every part of him wanted to rush in and rescue the child. He forced himself to stay calm. He knew it was the right thing to wait for trained officers. The minutes that followed felt like hours. Ethan crouched behind the oak, watching the nest from a distance. The man moved around it several times, gathering branches and adjusting the structure. Sometimes he disappeared into the woods for a short while and returned with more sticks. Each time Ethan noticed how protective the man was, glancing around nervously as if afraid someone would discover the hideout. Finally, Ethan heard a sound that filled him with relief, the faint wail of sirens in the distance. The police were on their way. He stayed hidden until the sound grew closer. Then carefully he waved his arm in the air to guide them toward his location. When the first two officers arrived, Ethan explained everything quickly. Their faces grew grim as he described the eyes in the nest and the strange man. The officers signaled him to stay back while they moved closer with caution. Ethan watched anxiously as they approached the nest, but the man must have heard the sirens too. By the time the officers reached the clearing, he was gone. The nest remained quiet and still. The officers shone their flashlights inside, and Ethan saw their expressions change. Whatever they saw confirmed his fears. One officer called on his radio for more backup, while the other looked back at Ethan with a grave expression. Ethan's heart pounded. He had done his part, but he knew this was only the beginning. Something terrible had been hidden in those woods, and now it was finally being uncovered. That night, as Ethan stood near the flashing lights of police cars, he thought about how a simple patrol had led him to a discovery that would change lives. He felt a mix of fear, sadness, and determination. Whatever secrets the forest had been hiding, he knew one thing. He had been right to trust his instincts. The clearing was filled with flashing lights as more police vehicles arrived, their headlights breaking the dark shadows of the forest. Ethan stood to the side watching as officers moved carefully around the giant nest. He still couldn't believe what he had stumbled upon during a routine patrol. The nest looked even stranger now under the glow of flashlights. It was huge, woven tightly together with bits of fabric and rope sticking out from the sides. Detectives began taking notes, photographing every angle, and marking the ground with small flags where footprints were visible. One officer crouched near the shoe Ethan had spotted earlier, lifting it with gloved hands and slipping it into an evidence bag. Another picked up the stuffed toy, and the whole group fell silent for a moment. The toy was old and worn, but it was clearly something that once belonged to a child. That silence was heavy, and Ethan felt the weight of it pressing on him. He explained everything again to a detective, a tall man named Harris, who was leading the case. Ethan told him about the footprints, the clothing scraps, the faint voice he had heard, and the human eyes that had stared back at him through the nest's branches. He also described the rough-looking man he had seen earlier, the one who seemed to be guarding the place. Detective Harris listened carefully, nodding, his face serious. "This isn't just some wildlife shelter," Harris finally said, his voice low. "Someone made this. And it's clear they were keeping someone here." The word sent a chill down Ethan's spine. His instincts had been right all along, but hearing it confirmed made his heart ache. He thought of the missing person posters he had seen pinned on bulletin boards in town, faces of young people who had never come home. Could this be connected? The officers moved in closer to the nest. With slow, careful movements, they began pulling back some of the branches. Ethan leaned forward, his stomach tight. At first, all that was revealed was a dark hollow lined with grass and fabric scraps. But then, in the beam of a flashlight, they saw movement. A small figure shifted inside. The officers froze for a moment, then one of them called out gently, "It's okay. You're safe now. We're here to help." Ethan held his breath. Slowly, very slowly. A thin, frightened child crawled out of the shadows. She looked no older than 12. Her hair tangled, her face pale and smudged with dirt. Her clothes were torn and too big for her, as if they had been borrowed from different places. She clutched the side of the nest, trembling, her eyes wide with fear. The officers stepped back slightly to avoid scaring her more. One knelt down and extended a hand, speaking softly. "You're safe. No one will hurt you. We'll take care of you." For a long moment, the girl didn't move. Then, with shaky steps, she crawled out completely. She glanced at Ethan for just a second, and he saw the same frightened eyes that had stared at him earlier. His chest tightened with emotion. As the officers wrapped a blanket around her, Detective Harris turned to Ethan. "If you hadn't found this, we might never have known she was here." The girl was quickly taken to a nearby vehicle where paramedics were waiting. They spoke gently to her, offering water and checking her condition. Ethan watched, his throat tight as she clutched the stuffed toy the officers had handed back to her. But relief was mixed with tension. The man Ethan had seen earlier was still out there, somewhere in the forest. The police set up a perimeter, their radios crackling with updates. Search teams were formed and dogs were brought in to track his scent. The forest, once quiet and peaceful, now felt alive with urgency. Officers moved quickly, shining flashlights through the trees, calling out commands. Ethan stayed close to Detective Harris, answering more questions as they worked. "He knew the forest well," Ethan said, describing the man. "He moved quietly, like someone who's been out here a long time. And he was protective of the nest, like he didn't want anyone near it." Harris frowned. "That tells me he'll try to come back. People like that don't just walk away. They think this is theirs." The thought made Ethan's stomach twist. The idea that someone had built this strange nest and kept a child there was horrifying. And worse, the man was still free, possibly watching from the shadows. Ethan scanned the dark trees, half expecting to see eyes staring back at him. The search went on for hours. The woods echoed with the sound of footsteps, dogs barking faintly in the distance and the low hum of radios. Every so often, a shout would rise as officers thought they saw something, but each time it led to nothing. The man had vanished into the forest's endless maze. Ethan felt restless, torn between relief that the child was safe and frustration that the man had escaped. He paced near the nest, unable to shake the image of the ragged figure slipping between the trees. He wanted to help search, but Harris insisted he stay back. "You've done more than enough," Harris told him firmly. "You found this place, and because of that, a child is safe. Let us handle the rest." Ethan nodded, though his heart still burned with unease. He couldn't help but feel a strange connection to the forest he had walked every day. Now it held secrets darker than he had ever imagined. As dawn began to break, casting pale light over the trees, the search teams returned one by one. The man had not been found. The forest, with its endless shadows and hidden paths, had swallowed him up. For now, at least. But even as disappointment spread among the officers, Ethan knew this was not the end. The truth had begun to surface, and it would only grow clearer in time. He thought again of the girl's wide, frightened eyes and the way she had clutched her toy. She was safe now, but there were still questions that needed answers. Standing at the edge of the clearing, Ethan promised himself he would not forget what he had seen. He would continue to watch the forest, Continue to protect it, not just for the animals and hikers, but for the hidden truths it might still hold. The woods had revealed one secret, and he knew there might be more waiting. The morning sun slowly rose above the trees, casting golden light across the forest. For Ethan, the long night felt like a blur. He had sat near the clearing, answering questions from detectives, watching officers search the woods again and again. The giant nest that had once stood hidden now looked different under the bright light of day. It was no longer just a strange discovery. It had become evidence of something dark, something carefully built and used for a purpose no one fully understood yet. The little girl they had found was taken safely to the hospital. Ethan had seen her climb into the ambulance, wrapped in a blanket, still clutching the stuffed bear tightly. Her face was pale, but there was relief in her eyes. She was safe, and that gave Ethan some comfort. Yet the mystery was far from solved. The man who had built the nest, the one Ethan had seen with his own eyes, was still somewhere out there. The forest was wide and endless, and it offered many places for him to hide. Detective Harris returned to the clearing with a group of officers. His voice was steady but serious. "We've searched all night, but he knows these woods well. We'll keep looking, but he's clever. He won't be easy to catch." Ethan listened quietly. He knew Harris was right. He had watched the man move through the forest with the ease of someone who had been living in it for a long time. People who knew the woods could disappear in plain sight. Still, Ethan believed that eventually the man would make a mistake. The detectives collected every piece of evidence they could find. They gathered the shoe, the fabric, the toy, and samples of the nest itself. They measured the footprints and photographed the ground carefully. Ethan stayed close, answering more of their questions. He explained again how he had first found the nest, what he had heard, and what he had seen. Each detail was written down. As the hours passed, more news began to spread. Reporters arrived near the edge of the forest, asking questions, setting up cameras. The story of the ranger who found a giant nest in the woods had already started to reach people in town. Ethan wasn't looking for attention, but he knew people would want to know what had happened. He kept his words simple when asked, saying only, "I followed my instincts. I'm glad the girl is safe." Later that afternoon, Ethan finally returned to the ranger station. He was exhausted, both physically and mentally. But as he sat at his desk, looking over his notes, he realized how important his discovery had been. Without it, the girl might have never been found. The thought gave him strength. Over the next few days, the police continued their search for the man. They used dogs, helicopters, and dozens of officers. The woods echoed with the sounds of the hunt. Ethan joined some of the patrols, guiding officers along trails he knew well. But the man remained hidden. It was as if the forest itself was protecting him. Despite the frustration, there was also hope. The girl began to recover. The town was filled with relief when they learned she had been reunited with her family. People praised Ethan, calling him a hero. He didn't feel like one. To him, he had only done what any ranger should do: pay attention, trust the signs, and act when something felt wrong. One evening, as the sun set over the forest, Ethan stood on a hill overlooking the trees. The woods looked peaceful, but he knew better now. Beneath the quiet beauty, there could be secrets hidden away, waiting to be discovered. He thought of the girl's eyes, frightened but strong, and he felt a deep sense of responsibility. Detective Harris had told him, "Without you, she might still be there. You gave her a second chance." Those words stayed with Ethan. They reminded him that even the smallest decisions, a choice to follow a trail, a choice to look closer, could change lives. Weeks passed, and while the man had not yet been caught, the case remained active. Ethan kept watch during his patrols, alert for any new signs. He never entered the forest the same way again. Each sound, each broken branch, each unusual mark in the soil made him pause and listen. He knew the woods could hide many things, but he also knew he was ready to face them. One quiet morning, as he walked along a familiar path, Ethan stopped and looked up at the tall trees. The forest was alive with birdsong again, as if slowly healing from the dark secret it had carried. A soft breeze moved through the branches, and for the first time in weeks he felt peace. He took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "This is why I'm here." To protect, to notice, and to act. Ethan didn't know what the future would bring. Maybe the man would be caught tomorrow, or maybe months from now. But one thing was certain: the discovery of that strange nest had changed him. He would always remember that behind the beauty of nature, There could be hidden stories, and sometimes those stories needed someone brave enough to uncover them. That night, as Ethan wrote in his journal, he ended with a single line. The forest spoke, and I listened, and because of that, a child was safe, and a truth had been brought to light.